What's up, guys? Believe it or not, today we're going to be drawing a car. I was hanging out with a friend earlier this week. We went and grabbed some coffee, and he came out in his 1972 Oldsmobile 442, and really pretty car. Now, there's not a lot that I would do to modify a car like this, but I thought it would be fun to draw, and maybe I can come up with something as I go. Got my reference photo, so now I'm going to pass it over to VoiceOver Chris. So if you recognize me and you think I might look similar to the other guy, it's because we both went to the same high school. Now what this is going to be more of a quick render. And for me, that's like something that's a bit faster, a bit more loose, and we'll get into the whys and why nots of that a little bit later. But for now, let's just jump right into it. Okay, have some notes here, have a finished rendering, and so the very first thing that I'm doing, the stage one, as it were, is the rough sketch. The way that I like to do a rough sketch is typically with ballpoint pen. This is usually, for me, I like blue. It just looks a little bit cooler than black ink. The way that it builds looks a little bit nicer, a little bit more progressive. You do have to be really careful when you sketch with pen. Obviously, there's no room for error in the terms of like being able to erase. So put all the lines down as accurately as you feel like you can. Make good guesses. Also, practicing with pen also helps you think about each line that you're going to make, since there is a little bit of consequence with each sketch line. Granted, this is just the rough sketch, so it doesn't matter how good or bad it is overall. We just kind of want to get the proportions and the details in place. But again, we don't have the space to erase, so we want to be careful, but we want to be intentional. We want a sketch that we can use. Now for me, a sketch like this, it can be pretty messy actually, and I can get away with quite a lot. I don't need a perfect sketch in order to be able to do the next stage. And it just takes practice to know what's ballpark, what's acceptable, how rough can I make this stage in order to make the next stage work. You know, I don't want to spend any more time at this stage than I need to. Earlier on, I spent a lot more time at this stage because I needed to know that it was as perfect as it can be to get to the next stage. But it's not really super critical. Alright, the rough sketch is wrapped up. Now let's go on to stage 2. This is called an overlay. Essentially what we do, we tear out the sheet of paper that we were sketching on from one sketch pad, and we slip it underneath of another sheet of paper. I went from one type of paper to another for the sake of this demo. It's not really critical. So most marker papers are semi-transparent, so you can see through them, which means if you've done a decent enough job bolding up a sketch, you can actually see all your lines through the paper, and you can use that and make a clean line drawing over top of it. This is a pretty common drafting technique. So what you want, obviously, is to be able to see the lines through the paper. And from there, I'm sketching over the ones that I think I want to keep. Obviously, I'm starting very light. And then I'm going to break out some ship's curves and some French curves and eventually some ellipses to make a cleaner version of this line sketch. I'm still freehanding a lot, but I am allowing the tools to create some accuracy out of my rough sketch. You'll notice my rough sketch was pretty rough, but that's something I can work with pretty easily. In one rough sketch stage like this, it's not going to be perfect. We're going to get sort of ballpark, but that's okay for the type of drawing that this is. We just kind of want to keep the process moving along at a decent pace, but get the accuracy there if we can too. So in this overlay process, I'm also avoiding the areas and the mistakes that I made previously. Obviously, I'm not just going to trace over every mistake that I made. That doesn't mean that I won't make more mistakes, but hopefully I'm making newer, better, cooler mistakes. Once the new drawing is nice and clean, I'll start to work the wheels a little bit. I had a design sort of in mind, something pretty traditional hot rod, street rod look. Nothing too crazy, but it's the last thing that I do because I want to make sure that the general sketch is good before I even bother with the wheels. Because if I can't get a good line drawing on this first overlay, then there's no reason for me to dive into the details of the wheels and trying to get them balanced and looking correct in the sketch phase. So I usually save them for last in the drawing phase because I don't want to waste any time. I want to make sure the main part is good and the wheels are pretty mathematic and formulaic from there. So that's why I save them for last. So stage 3, this is where the real fun stuff happens. This is the total rendering process. Now, I've gone over this a million times, at least in live demos and other videos, but for the sake of this video, I'll kind of go over it briefly again. Since I'm working a little bit faster in this demo, I'm working a little bit less precise. There is some kind of artisticness that comes from speed, but sometimes there's trade-offs as well, and the trade-off will be accuracy. With enough practice, you can get a good balance of both, being fast and accurate, but if I really wanted to do something accurate, I'd break out French curves and ellipses and do those for every single line, but that is way too slow for kind of a quick process like this one, so I'm not even going to worry about it. So the main tones are blocked in with marker, of course, as is tradition with these types of pieces. This is a traditional piece, so we're using traditional media. For markers, I'm using Chartpak AD markers, one of my favorite go-tos, especially for a fast render. They are a very wet marker, so they can get away from you pretty quick if you're slow or not careful or not as experienced with a marker. That is, of course, followed by airbrushing. Today I'm using Createx illustration paints. These are one of my all-time favorite paints to use, paired with an Iwata Airbrush. As in any of the demos that I've done, start with marker, build the tones, kind of build the shape. I'm mapping a lot of what I'm going to do with the airbrush. There's so much that I'm going to end up going over, but that's okay. The more I do in one stage, the less I have to do in the next, the less I have to do in the next, the less I have to do in the next. Each stage kind of paves the way to the next stage. So with the airbrush, I'm kind of bringing the color saturation up a bit, getting the blues up, the warmness up in some areas. Because it's a dark colored vehicle, black, you're going to have that really high contrast, and the upper surfaces are going to be a little cooler, and the lower surfaces are going to be a little bit warmer. Once the airbrush is wrapped up, I'm going to clean up a few edges with an eraser, and then start to detail the edges with a pencil. What's always interesting to me at this stage is that between the marker and the airbrush, things look kind of loose and really, really messy. Like, this is the stage where you kind of go, is this really coming together the way that I want? And it's hard to know until you get to very, very close to the end, where we're doing the details now with pencil and later with paint. This type of process does require a little bit of patience. Even though it is about going faster, it's about seeing it all the way through to the end result as well. Because if you just throw in the towel when it looks awful, then you're never going to be able to practice fixing the types of mistakes that you make when you go through a quick process like this. So with the pencil, I'm just kind of hitting some of the edges and cleaning up some of the marker that got away a little bit. This particular rendering is a little bit on the small scale for me, so the car is a little bit squished in the space here. But it also means that the marker can bleed a little bit. We can lose a couple of edges. And pencil is a great way to clean up those edges and bring some of those details back. And that will also pave the way towards the paint details. The paint details is the last part of this type of traditional rendering. This is essentially the white highlights. In other types of renderings, there are times when you want to break out some other colors to correct some other details or paint in some emblems. This is really fast, really conceptual. This was really just about throwing down some ink and some color and having some fun. So we're just focused on highlights here. So we can use the white pencil as a map towards where we want to put the highlights. In my mind, I always do the lighting from scratch, the color contour and the contrast from scratch. So where I put lights and contrast and highlights is a practiced thing. I know where I want to put it, especially with a view like this, especially with a dark color. A lot of that stuff just becomes second nature after you do it a million times. So to me, these highlights are really what kind of brings things up and sharpens up the edges. Where all the marker and airbrush starts to loosen things a lot, especially in this example where I'm not doing any masking or I'm not really taking very much care with the edges at all, the paint details are what starts to sharpen things up and bring things kind of back to where they should be. So it's the opportunity to fix some edges, create some highlights, create some contrast, do all the finishing touches. Like, this is where you kind of go, this is the last stage of what I'm going to do. What more do I got to do to make it look the way that I want? So there can be a little bit of back and forth sometimes. And while I'm doing this, I'll still break out some color pencil or even a Bic Pen, and I'll go over some lines, I'll fix some edges as I go. Just because I'm working in the paint stage at this point doesn't mean it's the only thing that I want to do and I'm not allowed to go backwards. This is the stage where we're looking at what the closest version of what it's going to be in its finality. So we want to use that time and the opportunity to correct as much as possible. But obviously, if it's too much of a mess in the beginning, it gets hard to save. So you have to moderate what that is for you for sure. So doing a quick rendering like this has some trade-offs, some good stuff and some bad stuff. I love working this fast, especially with a basic concept, because I can go through it really, really, really fast. The sketch takes a few minutes, the overlay takes twice as long as that maybe, and this rendering stage doesn't take very long at all. I did all of this, the entire thing, the rough sketch, the overlay, the final rendering. I'm even doing the voiceover. Everything I'm doing is just all like today, this afternoon. It's all in one sitting. So this type of format really does allow things to go fast. Once you know your tools, once you know how to move around the design a little bit, and if you got a decent background in sketching, that really, really helps, because the line drawing is kind of the more challenging part sometimes. If I've got a lot of time to sit down and do something, I will take my time and do the best job possible. But for the sake of demos, usually live stuff, anything where we're doing a video, for example, I generally want to do the fastest stuff possible, not only because it saves time, but because there is a style element that comes with it. And then also there are errors and mistakes that I make in the process of doing these that you really can't learn how to fix unless you're making the mistakes. So making the mistakes is part of the journey, and learning to fix them is just as important. I didn't really change that much as I already really like the car. Of course, I went with a simpler color. I think these look really good in black. I went with a bigger, more hot rod style wheel that has kind of a gray set of spokes and more of a polished rim, so there's a little bit of contrast. And then I did slant the nose just a little bit because I think cars look a little bit better when they have a little bit more of an aggressive front end to them. But the major change that I made was actually opening up the fender wells so that they're more rounded instead of this kind of squared, rounded brake looking thing. So I actually think it looks really good with a rounded set of fenders and just a little bit of flair on them. Just kind of a little bit more modern, clean look, but still is a great classic car, and it would look good even if I drew it completely stock. But I was already here, and when I'm doing the sketch, normally I just kind of draw what I think makes sense. I've got the reference with me, but while I'm drawing, I'm noticing what I would do different, so I just draw it in as I go. So that's just kind of the fun part of doing these types of process. Just draw it the way that I want to see it while looking at the reference and trying to put it together. So landing somewhere in the middle there. Well, thank you guys so much for checking out this video. I hope it was fun, informative, and I'll see you in the next one. Yeah.